The FGM F2E mle was a French interwar-era superheavy tank designed in 1924 by FGM, or the Société de Forge et de Governance Méditerranée, or the Forge and Governance Company Mediterranean, a company that had specialized not in tank making, but in shipbuilding. Their expertise in creating large ship designs was brought over for usage in some of France's superheavy designs, such as the F2E shown here. What was also more interesting was their secondary role. FGM dealt with political and economic relations between the French Navy and the government. Shortly after the Char 2C's introduction into service in 1921, it was quickly becoming apparent that the battlefield would require a new generation of vehicles to combat a possible future conflict. Even before the first designs of the Char 2C were drawn up in 1917, the French army was already looking for a possible future replacement. It was to be around 30 to 40 tons with a minimum of 25 to 50 millimeters of armor all around and fitted with a machine gun and 75mm cannon in a rotating turret. FGM replied with their F2E design in 1924, which shared many similar features to that of the Char 2C. The F2E mle was fitted with quite a formidable armament at the time, with a 75mm SA-85 cannon and a large 7-foot turret. Two Model 1890 7.5mm machine guns were placed in a dual-mounted turret in the front of the hull, with a singular MG placed in a rear-facing turret. The F2E mle required 13 crew to operate, which was exactly one more extra crew that the F2C required. It could carry 128 rounds of 75mm shells and over 11,000 rounds of machine gun ammo. The F2E also featured fairly heavy frontal armor from the time, with 40 to 50mm frontally, 30mm on the sides, and 20 to 25mm in the rear. The turret only had a maximum rotation of plus and minus 108 degrees, meaning it could not fire to its rear. However, that is why a rear turret was added for that very reason. All in all, this led to one very overworked commander. The F2E also had some quite unusual features, which, when talking about French tanks, is honestly quite normal. It featured two stroboscopic cupolas, which could rotate at a speed of 250 to 300 RPM. The cupolas consisted of an inner and outer shell, within the outer shell being powered by an electric motor. The idea was to remove the vulnerability of getting shot through a viewport. It would rotate at high speeds to give an optical illusion for the viewer, being as such as the cupola wasn't even there. The French were practically the only country to use the design in service. However, the Americans had also experimented with a stroboscopic cupola in 1926 on a single Mark 8 tank. The French had claimed that it would be resilient to bullet splash, but the Americans had discovered that the cupola cannot even withstand bullet splash from .303. Having a shipyard design a heavy tank ensured that much attention would be put into crew ergonomics, which is something that frankly most tank at the time completely ignored. Similar to the Char 2C, the vehicle was less cramped than earlier designs. The crew could walk, slightly crouch, or move about mostly freely throughout the hull. The mechanic could access the engine from both sides, and the commander could communicate with the driver, the front machine gunner, and the mechanic via speaking tubes. External communications were the mechanic's responsibility, who could open a small hatch on top of the turret to signal using flags, flares, or electrical lights. The tank could be entered through the cupola, but the crew members also had oval or rounded escape hatches to exit. The F2E mle also featured an unusual power system, having two V4 engines coupled together to power an electrical transmission, which outputted 537 horsepower at 1800 RPM, essentially making it a V8 engine of sorts. This is the same type of transmission system used on that of the Char 2C, albeit with far more technical improvements in its design. The F2E was slightly faster than that of the Char 2C, reaching speeds of up to 13 miles per hour or 20 kilometers an hour. Due to the nature of the transmission, it also allowed the vehicle to have an equal speed going forwards and in reverse, being essentially a large reverse gearbox with the same amount of gears and gear ratios. The tank was equally as massive, being over 30 feet or 9.3 meters long and about 14.5 feet or 4.42 feet tall, which was over a foot taller than that of the Char 2C. The tracks were 670 millimeters wide with a thickness of 50 millimeters. Surprisingly enough, it was also technically the first tank in the world to feature interleaf suspension. Called suspension entrelacée, the engineers at FGM had devised, years before the Germans did, a complex series of 60 road wheels and torsion springs that would yield a lower ground pressure than that of the Char 2C. However, it also faced the same problems that would also be found with that of the Germans with their interleaf suspension, mainly within problems of mud getting clogged up in between the road wheels, and also the very big and glaring issue of having to remove layers upon layers, 3 layers to be precise, just to remove or replace any damaged or broken wheels. In other words, an engineer's wet dream and a mechanic's worst nightmare. Even with how long the F2E was, the tank also included a large trench tail in the rear, just like that of the Char 2C. Now, the reason for this was an interesting one, as the fact that one of the requirements for this super heavy was for it to have outstanding trench, ditch, and river crossing capabilities, leading to one very long vehicle. One of the other reasons for such a large vehicle was its perceived role in battle. The F2E mle 24 was designed with pushing through heavily fortified defenses, with French commanders fearing a repeat of earlier battles during the Great War, with stagnant lines, hundreds of miles worth of trenches, and little progress made in advancement. Thus, this perhaps was also a look into their outdated mindset, seeing how little had changed in terms of design since the Great War. However, with the rapidly advancing paces of warfare, the F2E project was pretty much doomed from the start before it even left the drawing board, and the French army decided not to pursue the project, with a grand total of 3 prototypes being designed and subsequently scrapped in 1926. However, in 1925, before all 3 of the F2E prototypes were scrapped, as an experiment, one of the vehicles had its 75mm cannon removed and replaced with a large 155mm howitzer. Due to how large the turret was, very few modifications had to be done to fit the cannon inside. The ammo racks were adapted to carry the massive shells, with a maximum capacity of 38 rounds carried. Everything else was left practically untouched, with the only real changes being that the front trench tail was removed and a small jerry can storage was fitted in its place. However, as with the other 2 F2E prototypes, the F2E bis was scrapped as well in 1926. And thus we reach the end of our story of the FGM F2E. Being such a large vehicle, it would have presented itself as an equally as large target. The increased mobility and firepower was appreciated by French officials, deeming it as a superior evolution of the Char 2C. However, with such rapid advances in warfare being made nearly daily, the FGM F2E was already obsolete even before it was built. Had it been built, it may have been excellent at breaking through enemy lines, but by this point, German weaponry was already getting to a point where even having armor as thick as 50 millimeters wouldn't save it. And thus, as history continued, the Great War would not finish until 1927, leaving France without the super heavy tanks it desired. Of course, that does not mean France didn't try to pursue further super heavy tanks in the future. But that's a tale for another day.